I'm Swedge. For Dawn of the Hunt I gave an overview of my Incinerate Chronomancer while AFKing in a Trial of Chaos. I thought I'd up the ante and explain this build while AFK in an Uber Simulacrum, while having to deal with the less curse effect affix that nukes my defensive layering. Here's the short pitch. This is a trade league starter for players who want to be able to do all content easily and quickly without requiring a pivot to another build or to farm huge amounts of currency for build enabling gear, and to be almost unkillable while you do it. While there are builds that map more smoothly than this one, very few can AFK in the most dangerous content the game has to offer for a 10 to 20 divine budget, while also melting pinnacle bosses. The huge sustain you see here is from a Chrono Recoup stack, more powerful than it's ever been. Sacrosanctum lets you apply your life recovery to energy shield in its entirety. With ways to scale the effectiveness of VS Recoup, you can get huge numbers without overinvestment. Even though the build packs no evade, no block, and runs very little armour, as you can see, we're far from defenceless. For pseudo avoidance, we use the Chronomancer's Apex of the Moment slow, together with the Blasphemy support Temporal Chains, to make normal enemies act at 1/4 their normal speed. For the very hardest content like Simulacrum, you can augment this with Enfeeble Curse to take less damage, although for most content you'll slow Elemental Weakness instead to make clear smoother. For offense, we go Ignite all the way. Incinerate handles bosses easily, breaking 4 million Ignite DPS even on a tight budget and without requiring any expensive gear or support gems. For mapping we have several options that we'll look at in this video, but my favourite so far has been Volatile Dead, which received some undocumented changes in 0.3 and now works pretty well to clear maps. For content that doesn't leave corpses like Simulacrum, we're still able to juice Flame Walls DPS to get the job done, along with Incinerate. In this video, I'll go over how the build works, what gear you'll want, and how to progress your character through the early levels. In this section, I want to get into how the defensive layering of the build comes together, so that if you're ever feeling a little squishy, you'll be able to know how to course correct and get back to feeling borderline invincible. If any of these sections are a little too in-depth for what you're looking for, you can always use the video chapter marks to skip ahead. Any build in Path of Exile that wants to be really tanky generally needs to cover a few bases. We need a decent, effective health pool, be that with life, energy shield, or some mind over matter mana setup. Most builds will want some or all of their elemental and chaos resists capped. You want to have some avoidance in the build to reduce the frequency with which your health resources will take damage, and you want to have some further mitigation that reduces the magnitude of damage getting past your avoidance that you're forced to take. When you do take damage, you need to be able to sustain back your health resources before subsequent damage piles up and kills you. Resource regeneration, energy shield recharge, and recoup are the most common ways to do this. And finally, you'll want some way to handle ailments inflicted upon you, whether that's non-damaging ailments like shock or freeze, or damage over time effects like poison, bleed, or ignite. Some of these effects are far more dangerous for some builds than others. For instance, an evasion character that gets frozen and has their passive avoidance disabled isn't going to last long, compared to an archetype that tanks hits really well. Chronomancer is one of the least played Ascendancies because, very frankly, its damage scaling options are almost completely lacking at present. The Chronomancer does, however, have a number of interesting and unique answers to the defensive problems that each build needs to solve to become tanky. First, let's talk avoidance. While Chronomancer doesn't have any way to inherently boost passive avoidance like evade or block, it does have access to the Apex of the Moment slow. Slow effects in Path of Exile are multiplicative, which makes pairing this up with Temporal Chains often a no-brainer. Temporal Chains has some other benefits for builds using damaging ailments like this one, increasing the duration of those effects on your targets. Temporal Chains received a huge buff in 0.3, making it almost twice as effective. And remember, slows in Path of Exile aren't just movement speed effects, they apply to all enemy actions, including their attack and cast speeds. This means that without too much investment, and even with the penalty to curse magnitude from Blasphemy support, these two slows combine to hit the slow cap of 75% against normal rarity enemies. Higher rarity enemies get penalties to your slow reduction, but even rare enemies in this setup are slowed by 55%. In terms of how frequently you take damage, this is comparable to having an evasion chance somewhere between these two figures, and indeed can be more effective at reducing the frequency of damage you take, because enemies rarely have a chance to close distance before your proliferates and corpse explosions deal with them. My builds previously used Blink to utilise the remaining spirit allocation for permanent buffs, but Blink interacts absolutely horribly with the new sprint mechanic. When Blink's on cooldown, you can't sprint at all, and Blink still results in far too much terrain collision in my opinion to be a good mobility tool for Chrono this patch. That means we're free to slot another curse into Blasphemy here. Normally for mapping we'll run Elemental Weakness, providing something like a 50% more damage multiplier, But for more challenging and punishing content like Simulacrum, where a single death is extremely costly, the build still has enough damage with Incinerate to comfortably run Enfeeble here instead. This is able to hit 33% against normal enemies and 22% against rares, giving you a pretty substantial extra mitigation layer. While we're talking about Blasphemy Curse auras, we should also talk about another change Chronomancer received this patch. Sands of Time now consist of a scaling, cast speed and area of effect modifier buff, each one alternating against the other from 1% to 60%. This means that most of the time your curse auras cover a very substantial part of the screen, especially when ritualistic curse support gives you 50% increased area of effect at all times with 0 downside for blasphemy and 0 extra spirit investment. Finally, let's talk about Chronomancer's very powerful answer to the question of health sustain, Recoup. Chronomancer is really the only Ascendancy that can scale Recoup to the levels you're seeing in this simulacrum. Its Rapid River Ascendancy notable reduces the base recoup time from 8 seconds to just 4, which can be further reduced with increased speed of recoup effects modifiers. Since release we've had access to the powerful passive tree notable Pliable Flesh, supplying 25% increased speed of recoup effects. With the addition of the Soul Core of Convalescence in patch 0.2.1, giving another 10% per core if slotted in the boots, and 6% life recoup if slotted in the helm, Recoup Sustain got quite a considerable buff. This has been compounded in Rise of the Abyssal with the addition of the new unique belt, Darkness Enthroned, which lets socketed items act like they're socketed in some other gear slot while giving a huge increase to their effects. In my previous builds, I always struggled with what to do in the belt slot. Now we have a very obvious answer. My current belt has a 110% increased socket effect corruption, resulting in 42% increased speed of recoup effects. As a reminder, recoup doesn't turn off even when it fully repletes the relevant resource. The availability of significantly more recoup speed than before really covers the weakness of older recoup builds, namely that when you first start taking damage from a new pack you become vulnerable, because you don't have any recoup healing banked up, so sequential heavy hits can overwhelm your health pool. Now, the time it takes for your health resources to recover is incredibly low, so the time you spend in this vulnerable state without recoup banked up is correspondingly much lower as well. Let's have a look at my current recoup setup. It's relatively even split between the passive tree and my gear. If I'm taking chaos damage, I have a little less life recoup, but it's still over 107% total and 127% when taking elemental or physical damage. Sacrosanctum applies all of this to my energy shield, along with an additional flat 3% from Glazed Flesh. This means 130% base energy shield recoup for most damage I take. But we have two ways to effectively multiplicatively scale this. The first is the Soul Bloom passive, which has been buffed from 15% to 20% in patch 0.3. As a reminder, bonuses to generic resource recovery rate in Path of Exile don't modify the time it takes to recover, it modifies the magnitude of the overall recovery, so this is a 20% multiplier to our energy shield recoup. The second way to scale our ES recovery is also a pseudo damage mitigation method. Many of you may be familiar with the Lich Ascendancy notable Eternal Life, which means your life cannot change while you have energy shield. Lich stacks a huge amount of energy shield bypass, whereby a portion of incoming damage is redirected away from energy shield to life, giving it a baseline 25% damage reduction, so long as its energy shield is not depleted. In this dual life and energy shield recoup setup, Chronomancer can do effectively the same thing. Because we recoup so much life from every hit taken, we're able to redirect an amount of incident damage to our life pool, which almost instantly recovers. This means that just like Lich, so long as our energy shield does not break, we can benefit from an effective damage reduction that also shifts some of the recovery burden to life and gives your energy shield recoup another effective multiplier. With the At-Series Disdain Helmet and the Heavy Buffer Tree passive, we can redirect 15% of our damage to our life pool. Because our energy shield is still recouping the full value of the incoming hit, but only taking a fraction of the damage, we get an effective 18% multiplier to our ES recoup. Combining Soul Bloom and Bypass together, this yields an effective energy shield recoup multiplier of 141%. This takes my baseline 130% and scales it up to 183%. i.e. when my energy shield itself takes damage, it's recouping 183% of that amount over the recoup duration, an absolutely huge amount. Let's combine this with the treatment of the recoup duration. My current build fits in 77% increased speed of recoup effects, although more is possible with better gear and more rune sockets. This means a total recoup time of just 2.26 seconds. Let's imagine I take a physical or elemental hit. My life takes 15% of the damage and recoups that full amount in just 0.27 seconds. My energy shield takes 85% of the damage and fully recoups it over 1.23 seconds. Now, because recoup doesn't turn off at full resource, my life proceeds to recover a further 112% of the incident hit over about the next 2 seconds, while my energy shield, once full, recovers a further 83% of the incident hit over about 1 second. This results in a huge effective sustain under enemy fire, where every hit we take banks up recovery for a time, making us even more robust against further incoming hits, resulting in a build that can face tank a Simulacrum even when some of its defensive layers are being shut down by affixes. This also has a huge effect on how damaging ailments interact with our build. In patch 0.3, both Poison and Bleed were altered to bypass Energy Shield entirely, which I anticipated might have been a relatively large nerf to non-Chaos Inoculation Energy Shield builds like this one. But given the only thing that can apply a Poison or Bleed to you is a hit, and if you're getting hit, that means your life is regenerating 112% of the incoming hit even after it's healed from the bypass redirect, damaging ailments really aren't an issue at all. You can further negate the threat of any Poison, Bleed, or even Ignite by considering the Deterioration notable, which prevents damaging ailments being inflicted upon you while you already have one. It also gives a handy 20% Ignite magnitude for offense. This node is all the way at the bottom end of the tree, so it's a candidate consider for a Megalomaniac Jewel or an Amulet Anoint. Failing that, you can still slot anti-poison and anti-bleed charms in your build to further defend against damaging ailments. All of this means that what seemed like a huge nerf to hybrid life and energy shield characters in this patch turns out to not meaningfully affect this build much at all. Damaging ailments aren't a threat, even the ones that now bypass energy shield. As for chill and freeze, they remain an annoyance in terms of slowing you down, but they're not a threat in the slightest. Freeze doesn't disable your recoup, so you just sit there sustaining until you're thawed and you don't care at all. As for effective health pool, we're an intelligence character on the tree, meaning we have access to a huge amount of energy shield scaling that's very easy for us to pick up. One particular advantage is that, of the nodes on the tree that provide a huge percentage gain to energy shield in exchange for some downside, not a single one of those downsides is relevant to this build. Patient Barrier gives a huge 60% global ES in exchange for increased recharge delay, when this build barely cares about recharge at all. Melding gives 40% energy shield in exchange for 10% reduced mana, but because neither Volatile Death nor Incinerate use mana, the build really isn't very mana intensive at all. Heavy Barrier's 5% energy shield bypass, as we've already discussed, is actually a huge benefit to this build's defences. And because we stack life as well as energy shield, the reworked Enhanced Barrier notable now provides a huge amount of flat ES along with its 25% global increase. By taking max life on as many pieces of gear as possible, you can approach or even break 2k life in good gear, with energy shield values being able to exceed 10k, an absolutely giant effective health pool for the game's current level of content. Even without any shock immunity, you simply cannot be realistically burst down by most enemies in the game before their hits wind up healing you. So, to sum up the build's defences, we have a huge effective health pool through stacking life and energy shield, which alongside our capped resistances makes us almost entirely immune to being one-shot. We acquire considerable effective avoidance by slowing everything around us to a crawl, with the option to supplement Enfeeble Curse for more damage mitigation when threatened. Our recoup gives us a degree of recovery so high most builds could only dream of it. Hitting 83,000 energy shield recovery and 65,000 life recovery per second means you can AFK almost anything and not die. And the way our recoup interacts with hits means that damaging ailments are not really a concern. Our effective health is so high we don't really care about shock, and recoup isn't affected by freeze, meaning we don't die from ice ailments either. One possible avenue to scale the build's defences with better gear would be to acquire a little more crit damage reduction, as huge crits are about the only scary thing this build has to face, but even then it's exceptionally hard to die. All of that makes for a build that's extremely tanky across a variety of content, which given Path of Exile 2's more punishing nature when it comes to dying, I personally value a lot. Now, let's talk about the build's single target setup for bosses and pinnacle encounters. Because we have so many ways to easily scale its damage, this build uses Incinerate for bossing. Skill gems in general received a couple of major changes going from point 2 to point 3. The first major change is that multiple copies of the same skill gem with different support setups are no longer allowed. You can only slot one of each skill. This meant my previous dual Incinerate Chrono build had to see a significant overhaul. The second is that the limit on support gems was removed, meaning you can no longer have only one of each support gem across your skills loadout, giving us a lot more freedom in setting up individual skills. As for Incinerate itself, it saw quite a substantial rework. We'll compare the 0.2 version to the 0.3 version here. The changes are that, first, Incinerate now no longer costs mana itself. Instead, it requires mana expenditure on other skills to back up its own resource, fuel. Once fuel is fully stacked, it provides 10 seconds of cast time. I was really unsure about this change when I first saw it, but in practice, it's actually a pretty substantial buff. In my older setups, Incinerate's mana costs when you're stacking skill levels up to 36 and above were ballooning to be untenable. Now you'll naturally backfuel as you map, with more than enough to spend on isolated rare enemies. By the time you get to the end boss of a map, your fuel reserves will always be full. This change is also a great buff in dealing with mana siphoning enemies. It used to be a particular pain point for this build. Incinerate received some damage buffs in 0.3. It now does more base damage, and has 50% more stages, up 12 from 8. While each stage supplies a slightly less more damage modifier, the overall more modifier at full stacks has increased, up to 330% from 280. The third change is that Incinerate's stages no longer ramp up with a speed that scales with your cast speed. It's now static. You get one stage every 0.25 seconds. This combined with the increased number of stages means that you have to channel longer to reach maximum stacks. However, combined with the offloading of the exposure effects, more on that later, which used to entail casting Incinerate for a while after reaching full stacks, now you can stop as soon as 4 stacks are reached and you get a critical tick, which should be immediately apparent in your DPS. The fourth change is indirect but related to the previous. Burst Support got an upgraded version of itself that fully stacks to 40% more damage in just 2 seconds down from 4. This is a nice quality of life increase for tackling isolated rare mobs while mapping, and makes your ramp up damage while bossing a little more consistent. The fifth change is that Incinerate actually received a small baseline critical hit chance of 6%. This remains low enough that to exploit crit damage ignites you'll still want to be applying critical weakness, but it makes the frequency of rolling crit ticks of Incinerate about 60% higher than before, again improving the consistency while bossing. The final change is probably the most impactful, and the most surprising change to turn out to be a buff. Incinerate lost its exposure effect, which moved over to the Frost Orb skill. Exposure effects were also nerfed in general, with higher rarity enemies receiving a penalty to exposure resistance reductions against them, maxing out at a 50% penalty versus bosses. At first I suspected this was a huge nerf, but it's actually turned out to be a considerable buff for a few reasons. First, applying exposure is now much easier. You simply drop a Frost Orb on a really short cast time and it quickly pulses in a large area, building up exposure. It's worth noting that at present, only the maximum exposure value is penalised against higher rarity monsters. The effect still accumulates build-up at the same speed as against normal enemies. This means that you reach the full exposure effect very quickly. Secondly, the exposure effect being decoupled from your primary damage skill means that we can pursue exposure effect passives on our secondary weapon passive tree, leaving more room to pick up other damage nodes on our primary tree. This means that we can easily stack increased exposure effect to 90% with gem quality, support gems, and passive tree nodes, meaning that even with 50% less exposure effect against bosses, you're still stripping away 61% of elemental resistances, a comparable amount to before the patch. Thirdly, this makes reapplying exposure for any reason significantly easier. If your Ignite fell off against a target due to some boss phasing or poor positioning, you'd have to rechannel the entire Incinerate for an extended period past full stacks to reapply exposure, which can leave you quite static and very vulnerable. Now, you just have to drop a Frost Orb every 15 seconds or so, and you easily maintain full stacks. That's quite a set of changes, but it ultimately adds up to considerable damage and quality of life buffs for Incinerate as a whole. Let's move on to our single target skill rotation. Whereas before we used to manually apply our Elemental Curse, in this setup we can slot Elemental Weakness into our Blasphemy for automated application. If you'd like to manually apply a heightened curse supported version of the gem you can, but it can be a bit fiddly to switch gems around, so I just let Blasphemy handle it for me. My damage is more than enough. The first thing you'll do is pre-cast a Frost Bomb just before the boss becomes active, to start applying the exposure effect. This happens on your secondary weapon set. Remaining on this set, as soon as the boss is active, you'll start shotgunning your Ball Lightning into it to apply critical weakness via the Effigy of Cruelty focus. We set up Ball Lightning to optimize both crit chance and number of hits per cast, to apply critical weakness efficiently. Then we start channeling Incinerate on the primary weapon set. Once it reaches full stacks at 3 seconds, or is close to reaching full stacks, you're keeping an eye out for a critical damage tick where the ignite magnitude will rise substantially. At this point you're free to stop channeling. The great thing about Incinerate being a sustained skill is that every tick rolls crit independently, meaning you don't need investment in critical hit chance to be able to reliably hit a critical ignite, given the skill's very high tick frequency. After this, you'll cast Rapid Assault at the target, which is on the secondary weapon set. By using Scythe's Spear to bleed the target and then aggravate the bleed, which we almost always do in a single Rapid Assault cast, we'll aggravate all ignites on the target. This yields a 100% more damage modifier that really lets this build shine for killing pinnacles and citadel bosses with high health pools. The last step is to do two things. You'll spend your time shotgunning the boss with ball lightning to refresh your aggravated crit ignite via the Eternal Flame 3 support gem, which is another nice buff to this build, which used to rely on the Total Incineration Tree passive, which was only a 10% chance to refresh on crit compared to this support gem's 20%. If the boss is going to live much longer than 15 seconds, you can also quickly recast Frostbomb to maintain exposure stacks. But, realistically, with any decent gear and levels, the boss isn't going to last that long. Even without a manual elemental weakness curse, my Ignite DPS is around 4.3 million, and that's without any Incinerate Prism of Belief and with plenty of room to improve my gear and jewels. While we're not one-shotting the boss like, for instance, some Lightning Arrow builds can, for the extremely low level of currency investment, this is still a really great build for bossing, especially given how little danger most encounters can pose to this setup. If you were familiar with my old chrono guides, not much has changed on the single target side of things outside of the setup getting a little smoother. The pain point of an Ignite focus build in PoE2 was always going to be mapping. While I acknowledge that compared to the S tier tankiness and solid A tier bossing, mapping is still the weak link of the build. But it has gotten, in my opinion, significantly smoother in patch 0.3, with far more options for how you want to play. The biggest change by far is with the introduction of flammability. While many would have considered this a nerf, when it comes to the ignites as though dealing skills that have pseudo hits from which an ignite is calculated, this has turned out to be fairly neutral, especially once you stack some flammability magnitude. These skills no longer auto-ignite the target as before, but begin by stacking flammability on the target, which is affected by the target's ailment threshold. Once the flammability reaches 50%, the target automatically ignites. This is in contrast to fire skills that hit enemies, where the chance to ignite depends on the flammability, the target's ailment threshold, and the magnitude of the hit. With this setup, pretty much every skill breaks 50% flammability in a single tick. And because flammability applies before a hit or pseudo-hit decides if it ignites, this means that my setup still instantly ignites with basically every fire ability in the game. Another huge change this patch for Ignite build was something that didn't even make it into the patch notes. Volatile Dead, a PoE1 staple, has seen a major rework. In patch 0.2 and before, this ability launched a volatile core from an enemy corpse that would seek out enemies and explode. This delayed damage profile meant it wasn't that well suited to being a primary mapping skill. In patch 0.3, this skill has been changed to instead launch a volatile core that will track enemies for 5 seconds, igniting anything in its vicinity, and then detonating at the end of its life. By stacking ignite magnitude, these ignites can rapidly kill enemies as the core moves through them, resulting in a more direct damage profile. The 5 seconds of heat seeking the core does before detonating also improves the fluidity of map clear, as the core hunts down enemies across all corners of the map and even sometimes off screen. To augment the smoothness of clear, the build now uses a unique ring that has been in the game since launch, the Crackle Creep. This effectively packages the wildfire support into every fire skill you cast, including Incinerate, without taking up a valuable support gem slot. This lets Volatile Dead use the classic Wildfire Fiery Death combination, only taking one support slot, with the other 4 free to boost the skill's damage. I like to run a setup that uses Ignite 3 to both make ignites burn faster and to improve the flammability application of the cores, ensuring that even if you're running a map with increased monster ailment thresholds, the cores still immediately ignite their targets. The build stacks so much ignite magnitude that Searing Flame is the single best damage support gem for the Ignite DPS, even with the 30% penalty to the fire pseudo hit of the cores. Considered casting and controlled destruction provide reliable damage increases with limited drawbacks that boost the damage and smooth out the clear. The end result is a build that has remarkably efficient clear per cast, even if enemies don't die as fast as some meta builds. Just one single volatile dead core can seed a huge amount of destruction across the screen via ignite proliferation and corpse explosions. The setup really excels in any kind of static content like ritual, expedition, or strongboxes, where you can use the build's tankiness to plant your feet and spam casts to flood the screen with cores and corresponding explosions, effectively spawn camping the Abyssal hordes and ritual sacrifices. The most effective way to play this build is to stay mobile. You're a damage over time build that with just a couple of casts will kill everything within a couple of screens, but first your cores need to spread the ignites. As such, it's best to just keep moving into the next pack after you've seeded your destructive ignites, knowing that everything is going to die behind you and your loot filter can alert you if required to jump back to a corpse with Temporal Rift. The build also has ample room for slotting a skill gem that you can use with the Arbiter's Ignition support to trigger Flame Arc at will, giving you 20% more fire damage in exchange for being only able to inflict fire damage for the duration. We're a strict mono fire build anyway, so this has no downside for us whatsoever. I do this with Fireball, which can sometimes be handy for killing remote packs in an awkward location on the map. If you're about to run into a dense abyss or breach, one cast into the horde will be sufficient to guarantee your Flame Archon, with the built-in wildfire provided by Crackle Coop as its ignites rapidly spread, giving you many chances to proc Arbiter's Ignition. For content where no corpses exist from which to spawn volatile dead cores, like Delirium maps or Simulacrum, we have an alternate way to clear. Flamewall can be very cheaply scaled to do surprisingly high Ignite DPS, especially given +3 Prism of Belief jewels for Flamewall sell so cheaply. You can scale the damage well enough that it's possible to use Spell Cascade for significantly improved area coverage, while eating the 30% less damage modifier the support gem slaps you with and still kill enemies relatively quickly. Proliferation means anything remotely near your flame walls will eventually catch fire and burn down, it's just a matter of time, so stay mobile and keep moving to maximise mapping speed and efficiency. An alternative Ignite delivery skill is to use a more traditional Fireball setup. This skill has the least initial Ignite spreading coverage of all the skills considered so far, but the projectile nature of the skill makes it intuitive and easy to use. Fork support is invaluable for ensuring you cluster damage and start the fiery death chains as soon as possible. You can pair this with Snap to generate fire remnants that empower your fireball casts for more coverage at the cost of the clear being a little more fiddly. A good tip for Snap usage is to only use it when you see a fiery death corpse priming, so that you can consume the ignites across an area knowing that the corpse explosion will still kill everything in the area. The ceiling on this skill is potentially quite high, with a good fire infusion and several ways to scale projectiles. However, Fireball is seeing a lot of play at the moment, so its Prism of Belief jewels are very expensive, over 50 divines for a +3 jewel at time of recording. As such, I'd personally avoid this when starting the build and try to scale Volatile Dead or Flame Wall instead. In the case of either Flame Wall or Fireball, you'll need to solve for mana in a way that Volatile Death with its 0 mana cost does not. This can most ideally be managed with mana on kill 1 suffix, or failing that, with 3 passive points on the tree picking up the efficient killing cluster near the sorcerer and witch starting point. One of the huge upsides of Ignite Recoup builds are how cheaply they can be put together. None of the gear is particularly meta this league, nor has it been meta in any other league so far. The uniques the build relies on are all extremely cheap, especially to start out with. Entry-level versions of each one can be found for a single exalt. Sacrosanctum defines the build's defensive strategy, making your life recoup also apply to Energy Shield. In Path of Exile, Energy Shield builds tend to get extremely high health pools in exchange for recovery that is less strong or more conditional than life recovery. Sacrosanctum lets you get the best of both worlds. Even though it's a cheap unique, it's fairly high level, packing affixes for 2 attributes you need, Chaos Resistance, Life Recoup, and a dual curse enabling spirit implicit, while supplying a modest amount of energy shield and armor. At Series Disdain is very synergistic to our defenses. It supplies the majority of energy shield bypass, scaling our damage mitigation and our effective energy shield recoup. Because we got stack some life, the gain life as energy shield affix is huge, giving my current setup over 2k total energy shield. As a bonus, it packs some item rarity for farming. While giving up a rare ring socket can be punishing for many builds, not this one. The only offensive affix possible on rings relevant for this build is percent fire damage, and Crackle Creep supplies it. The major draw of this ring is the built-in wildfire support that it gives every fire skill you inflict ignites with. This frees up a tremendous amount of power via support gems, often amounting to a 25% or higher more damage multiplier for your fire skills when using this ring. The last primary unique is the belt slot, but it's not necessary until you hit really punishing endgame content, so this is a great slot to run a rare belt to help flesh out your life and resistances early in gear progression. For deep endgame setups, the Boots version of Darkness Enthroned lets us ramp up our recoup speed to extreme levels never before possible. The difference this makes in challenging content like Simulacrum is huge. If you want to add more movement speed to the build in exchange for a little tankiness, you could slot some movement speed runes here instead for a huge quality of life boon, although said runes are tremendously expensive. In our secondary weapon slots we run two further uniques. Scythe's Spear bleeds enemies and then aggravates those bleeds. In doing so, it also aggravates all ignites on the target, effectively supplying a 100% more damage modifier. This really lets the build shine on pinnacle content and challenging endgame empowered bosses at max difficulty. The last unique is the Effigy of Cruelty focus, which has a single job to apply the critical weakness debuff to bosses via crits you inflict with ball lightning spam. Critical weakness at full stacks gives all hits against the target an additive 10% chance to be critical hits. This gives Incinerate a total 16% base critical strike chance before modifiers, letting us reliably hit a critical tick of the cast that will inflict a crit damage boosted Ignite, letting us access further more damage modifier. Before we get into the rare gear slots, we'll talk stat priors. With regards to main stats, you want just enough intelligence to use your level 20 spells, and just enough dexterity to use Scythe's Spear, and then you fully focus on strength to scale your max life and in turn your energy shield. Defensively, your best stats are Elemental and Chaos Resistances, Max Life and Energy Shield, Recoup effects, be that increases to your life recoup or faster recoup modifiers, Curse and Aura Magnitude modifiers to scale Temp Chains and optionally Enfeeble, these also scale your offense via Elemental Weakness. Stun and Ailment Threshold scaling. Given the high amount of energy shield we run compared to life, usually this takes the form of gaining threshold equal to a percent of your max ES. Offensively we scale well from, in order of importance, flat damage, which for spells comes entirely from spell levels, so like most builds we stack as much as is possible. Extra percent damage as fire provides multiplicative scaling. We note that for builds that ignite as though dealing pseudo hits, only extra fire works here. Extra cold and lightning damage do nothing. Ignite or ailment magnitudes. These form their own collective multiplier in your damage, making them a priority to scale. Generic increased damage modifiers such as elemental, fire, spell, hit damage, etc. Crit damage modifiers, which multiplicatively scale your incinerate but not meaningfully your mapping skills. And then finally, cast speed doesn't really affect your damage, but having some can smooth out how the build feels while mapping, although usually you'll have a decent amount of it already from running Sands of Time. Note the critical hit chance is a very low priority, as you'll never really have enough to help your mapping skills hit crits consistently, and Incinerate can still reliably crit with its base rating plus critical weakness given its extremely high tick rate. When we discuss the rare pieces, note that my setup is still fairly inexpensive, and so there will be some dead affixes on my pieces. I'll list the desirable affixes on the left per piece. If you're running a Fireball or Flame Wall mapping setup, you don't worry about the wand's base so much, but for the Volatile Dead variant, you only get this skill on a Volatile Wand base. Volatile Dead only gets its 5th support gem slot at level 20, meaning you'll clear far more efficiently and more smoothly with a wand that supplies this skill level. However, this can put something of a strain on your affixes, driving up the potential price of the item. A level 18 Volatile Dead with 4 support slots is still enough to start clearing, you just might have to cast Flame Wall and Incinerate a little more frequently than with the max level wand. For affixes, the main priority is to have as many levels of all fire spell skills as possible, greatly boosting your spell's flat damages. Next, you want a high damages extra fireball, ideally without lightning or cold affixes. Flammability is the next priority, but you don't need a very high tier here, even T4 or T3 would be fine. This helps ensure that even on maps where enemies have increased ailment threshold, any skill you use will still instantly ignite them. After that, spell damage and fire damage rolls are fantastic. This build doesn't pick up a huge amount of increased damage modifiers, so any amount you can get from this wand will be extremely impactful. The increased elemental damage desecration prefix can be a great way to pick this up, and can be a great way to finish off a budget wand that has an open prefix. For the final open suffix, you're mainly picking up some quality of life. Intelligence, mana per kill, cast speed, or maybe some crit damage bonus can all be useful here. For the focus, offensively you want +3 level of all spell skills and a high spell or fire damage roll. Then you want a ton of energy shield with a good flat and good percentage ES roll. This is a great slot to ramp up your defences. Finally, you round out the focus, ideally with some resistances. The amulet is a powerful slot for this build. +3 to level of all spell skills gives huge flat damage and is the priority. Amulets are the only place where life recoup can roll as a rare affix, with T1 going up to 24% before any catalyst modifiers. You want a high roll here to lessen the pressure on your passive tree and make your recovery engine stronger. Then you'll want to scale your defences. Flat ES and then %ES or global defences are great here, making you significantly tankier. % increased life and max life are also fantastic. For your open suffix, a resistance affix, cast speed, crit damage or increased rarity are all great here, but these are more marginal. We'll talk anoints a little later. For your rare ring slot, in the prefixes we want high max life rolls. Increased fire damage is the only offensive affix possible here and is great to have. And finally, some max mana can help future-proof your build against mana cost creep with increasing skill levels. For suffixes, elemental and chaos resists are great. You can also acquire mana per enemy killed here for some sustain, especially important if you're not using Volatile Dead. Cast speed can give a little quality of life while mapping. And finally, increased item rarity and a prefix, suffix, or both will feel really great here. For the glove slot and the prefixes, you want high life and high energy shield as your priority. For suffixes, at the very highest end, you'll want 100% increased effective socketed items via the Essence of Horror, but these can be very expensive and aren't necessary to do all the game's content. These will scale your Ailment Magnitude runes run here, adding considerable extra damage. In lieu of that, shoring up elemental and chaos resistances can be very useful and probably necessary given how many uniques we run. A crit damage bonus is nice to have here for incinerate scaling, and any attribute roll here will ultimately result in more strength either here or on your passive tree. Increased item rarity is again also very desirable. For the boots, your first priority is 35% increased movement speed. We're not a particularly mobile build, so we really want the max available movement speed on the affix. Then high max life and energy shield are your defensive priorities. As is the case in the glove slot, this is another place Essence of Horror can be useful to scale either your recoup speed or movement speed runes depending on which you prefer and how rich you are. For the other affixes, you'll want some good resistance rolls. There are some good rolls for making elements less annoying in this slot, like reduced freeze duration or corrupted blood immunity via desecrations. Reduced movement speed penalty from using skills can also be nice for quality of life while mapping. For the socketables, we'll list the overall priority per slot. Reaching elemental and chaos resistance caps, or at least enough to feel comfortably tanky, will often supersede the per slot concerns here. If you need to run a resistance rune or soul core in any slot, do so, but prioritise slots where you'd otherwise take percentage defense runes which are less consequential, especially the focus. I'll note that my current setup does not run any of the very expensive greater runes listed here, like Assandra's Rune of Wisdom or Farrell's Rune of the Chase. The former would be substantially more damage, especially in a WOD with 2 or 3 sockets, and if you're not getting a build tanky enough to AFK in simulacrums because it makes for a catchy video hook, Farrell's runes for speed will probably make the build feel significantly smoother while mapping. While corruptions are usually more of a very late game min-max for most builds, the gear this build uses is generally so cheap that often you can find well corrupted bargains on the trade site. If you enjoy the build and want to scale it even further, the listed corruption effects can be a powerful, albeit sometimes risky way to do so. For gear where you can run an impactful socketable, an extra socket is going to be welcome, particularly in the wand, gloves, helm and boots. Of particular note among the corruption enchants is the life recoup corruption on the Sacrosanctum. Perfect rolls give the chest as a whole a whopping 30% damage taken recouped as life, either making you even tankier, or alternately freeing up passive tree points to take more damage nodes. These can be fairly expensive in terms of this budget build, usually starting at around 5 divines to get a combined 15% or higher recoup. If you're lacking this corruption, you can pick up some more passive tree nodes to meet whatever tankiness requirements you have. I'll also note that Crackle creeps with handy enchants like percentage early resists are still going for a handful of exalts and are very attainable. A quick note on charms, one in particular is very strong for this build, the Forsaken Bangle Amethyst charm. For the duration, 50% of chaos damage taken we prevent when hit is recouped as life and mana during the effect. As a reminder, because of the 20% physical and elemental recoup we pick up on the tree that we lack a chaos version of, and because chaos damage does double damage to energy shield, chaos is by far the most dangerous damage this build takes. If you're running high chaos resists, you prevent a large amount of chaos damage from each hit, and therefore the amount this charm recoups can become exceedingly high. This charm lets us make up some of our sustained shortfall compared to taking other damage types. While the build isn't particularly bothered by ailment immunities while it's actively being hit, more isolated rares can still be irritating if they bleed or poison your life pool while there aren't a number of other enemies around hitting you to generate life recoup. As such, poison and bleed immunity charms are still welcome here, albeit not really required for the build to feel smooth. As an Ignite build, Sapphire Jewels can represent a huge amount of damage scaling for us. 15% increased ailment magnitude and 15% ignite magnitude both roll as Sapphire prefixes, meaning each jewel slot gives us a potential 30% to our ignite magnitude. The build correspondingly picks up a decent amount of jewel slots, around 4 or 5 depending on routing. Good suffixes are varied but include some really great utility options. Gain additional stun or ailment threshold equal to a percent max energy shield can roll up to 15%, which can help prevent irritating micro stuns and further reduce the danger ailments posed to the build. 3% damage taken recouped as life is a reasonable pickup here for a touch more sustain. Ailments deal damage up to 7% faster can be a good all-purpose DPS increase. If you really want to juice your incinerate damage, increased critical damage bonus and critical spell damage bonus are also great options here. Jewel suffixes can also be a great place to amplify your flammability, with rolls up to 20% increased. We should also note the increased chance to inflict ailments appears to do nothing for flammability chance at present and should be ignored. If you're running Flame Wall as your mapping skill, a +3 Prism of Belief jewel can be grabbed for less than a divine, and gives a huge 50% more damage modifier, well worth giving up a rare jewel slot for. We'll also note that while the unique Heart of the Well jewel can roll again 15% extra damage as fire affix, most of the other desecrated modifiers present on the jewel aren't really worth running over a rare sapphire, so we can safely ignore these extremely pricey chase items. To cap off our gear discussion, we'll look at Megalomaniac jewels and Anoints together, as both offer a way to benefit from powerful notable passives that are otherwise inefficient or impossible to path towards. What Megalomaniac jewels you have access to will therefore affect your choice of Anoint. We'll start with Soul Bloom, a notable that you will always take for its 20% multiplicative scaling to our total energy shield recoup. While this node is well situated on the tree next to the intelligent starting point, it requires taking 3 points of completely useless increased energy shield recharge rate to get to. Given it's not an in-demand notable, Megalomaniacs with Soul Bloom and one other useful notable are often quite cheap to pick up. Next up is Deterioration, which as discussed before makes ailments considerably less dangerous to the build as well as giving a decent damage boost. This node is all the way at the other side of the tree in the dex zone and would otherwise be completely inaccessible to us. We'll also note Pliable Flesh, which with its 25% faster speed of recoup effects is a fantastic node to pick up for tankiness. Despite being quite close to our tree, it's in a somewhat isolated area, otherwise requiring 7 passive points to pick up, making it a great candidate here. In terms of damage options, there are several of note, listed here in terms of desirability. Lasting Trauma and Immolation are somewhat near the bottom extent of the tree if you path to the nearby jewel sockets, so it might be obtainable as part of your regular setup, but are still very desirable notables to have anyway. All of these are worth hunting down on a Megalomaniac. Chronomancer is one of the most underplayed Ascendancies at present, and has been since launch, overshadowed by its flashier, higher damage siblings available to Sorcerer and Witch. This build runs Chronomancer almost entirely for its access to the Rapid River, without which Recoup cannot be a first class defensive setup. If this node were on a different Ascendancy class, I would 100% be playing that class instead. Second in power to this is Apex of the Moment, with its 20% slow presence aura inflicted upon enemies. This scales well with temporal chains to mean that even in a blasphemy setup with less curse magnitude, you can still easily slow cap normal enemies with low investment, and even remain quite close to it for rares. Third is Quicksand Hourglass, offering the reworked Sands of Time buff. While a little unwieldy at times, and ultimately a little underpowered, this averages out to give a decent amount of cast speed and increased area of effect, both of which are stats this build really likes for quality of life. The last slot is a little dire, with nothing that great standing out. As such, we take Footprints in the Sand, offering the Temporal Rift skill. If you're familiar with League of Legends, it's basically Echo's ultimate, complete with the heal. This is decent to have if you dive into a bad situation and want to prevent a death, but honestly, I barely use it. I only picked this up because literally every other option in the tree does completely nothing for me. Despite seeing some changes to the Chrono Ascendancy, it's still in a fairly underwhelming spot on the whole. Having said that, I can't help but love it at least a little, because of how its unusual answers to defensive scaling can provide builds that clear content for an absolute song when it comes to price. On another Ascendancy, I'd struggle to get a build that could AFK tank a Simulacrum for 10 to 15 divines. Chrono manages it easily and only gets tankier with more investment, while still being able to deal enough damage to clear everything well. The best way to interrogate a passive tree is really to load it up yourself in the Path of Building tool and look at what it's doing. If you're interested in playing the build, the PoB is linked in the video description, but we'll have a quick look at the endgame setup I'm running for some general points. For defences, we do 3 things. We pick up a number of easily accessible recoup clusters. Note that we're not hitting all of them, we simply don't need to in order to reach our sustain goals, leaving more points for other uses. Second, the build picks up max ES nodes and is entirely able to ignore recharge rate and recharge delay nodes, making our defensive investment a little more efficient. Third, the build picks up some curse magnitude and aura magnitude, boosting our blasphemy support enabled defensive layering. Unlike many manual application curse builds that can load up curse magnitude on their secondary tree, blasphemy locks to taking it on our primary setup. These nodes also increase our damage considerably when running elemental weakness. For offense, we hit fire damage clusters and ignite magnitude clusters and pick up 4 or 5 dual sockets depending on your setup. Crit damage nodes can also be solid here to juice incinerate single target damage. Given we cast our damaging skills on our primary tree, we load this up with damage nodes. For the secondary tree, we do 2 things. The first is stack elemental exposure nodes to boost the exposure provided by our Frost Bomb, cast with the secondary weapon set. The decoupling of Incinerate with exposure enables this, letting us redirect points on our main and primary weapon swap trees to damage increases instead of having to pick up exposure there. The second purpose is to stack a substantial amount of critical strike chance to facilitate 2 things with our ball lightning casts. Firstly, so our casts rapidly stack critical weakness on bosses, which require critical hits to apply the debuff. And secondly, it allows us to refresh our ignites on pinnacle bosses via the Eternal Flame support gem, refreshing ignites on crit. This lets us set up a big aggravate ignite a single time and then easily maintain it no matter how much health the boss has. This build really comes online at level 68 when you can finally equip Sacrosanctum. Until that point, your best bet is probably to level with the lightning skill setup using Spark or Arc. There exist many high quality leveling guides out there on how best to build for this, so it would be a little redundant for me to do that here. I'll merely point out a few things that can help smooth out your journey. Acquiring more spell levels on your gear, specifically the Wand and Focus or Staff, and your Amulet, can provide huge damage increases and prevent boss fights in the campaign from becoming a slog. Try not to neglect your defences. Having a high energy shield with good bonuses to recharge delay and recharge rate along with a convalescence buff skill can really make you tanky and reduce your risk of dying. This of course also applies to energy shield on your armor bases and your elemental resistances. Max life really helps your tankiness too. If leveling specifically as Chronomancer, take Sands of Time for your first Ascendancy for the bonuses to cast speed and increased area of effect, into Apex of the Moment for a little more pseudo tankiness. At this point you lack meaningful amounts of recoup to make the Rapid River worth taking. Following these ideas, the campaign leveling with Arc for me was very smooth. bosses didn't last long at all, and I only had a single campaign death at the very last boss of the final interlude. That was a touch frustrating. This will keep you going until early mapping when you hit 68 and can swap to the Ignite build properly. At level 68, you can finally equip the item that lets you generate your incredible sustain, Sacrosanctum. By this point, you can equip all other uniques in the build, so it's time to rummage through the trade site bargain bin for all of them and to pick up any solid rare armor to shore up your defenses. It's worth buying an entry level volatile dead wand and a focus with some spell skill levels to get your fire damage rolling. Finally, get an amulet with some spell levels and a life recoup affix to keep your sustain high. Your passive tree at 68 can look something like this. You'll collect the recoup cluster near the starting point to ensure your sustain is substantial enough, but drop it once you get enough recoup on your gear. You can also pick up some of the cast speed and damage nodes near the starting location to get some easy DPS boosts. From this point on, you'll balance scaling your max ES, your life recoup, and your damage as you gain access to more points. Even later on, you'll get your curse and aura magnitudes to scale defense and offense at once. So to recap, this Trade League build that can be assembled for pocket change has S tier tankiness, solid A tier bossing, and maybe a good B+ when it comes to mapping. I don't mind the mapping being a bit behind the other factors all that much, because with a build like this, you don't really need to farm much to tackle every piece of content the game has to offer. The gear can be assembled so cheaply. So if you enjoy off-meta builds and playstyles and value your time and want to give it a try, the path of building and a link to a Mobalytics guide are in the comments. Well, that guide went on a touch longer than I'd anticipated. I don't make any money at all from doing this, it's all for the love of the game and building fun stuff to share with folks. So if you want to like or share this video, that'd really help me out. And if you're still here, thank you so much for putting up with my ramblings for almost a solid hour. This was really fun to make, and I hope to be able to refer back to this comprehensive deep dive on the Ignite Chrono when PoE2 receives inevitable changes in development and I have to tweak the build in coming leaks. If you'd like to see those updates as they come, or any other PoE mechanical or building deep dives that I get up to, feel free to sub to the channel. Thanks again, and I hope you have a really great day.